Ladies and gentlemen, dear distinguished guests, in my role as member of the management board of the Albert Einstein Society and on behalf of the president, who cannot be here with us today, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Einstein Lectures 2024. As you may know, the Einstein Lectures are dedicated in turn to physics, mathematics, and philosophy, reflecting the interests of Einstein. This year, it is already the 15th edition. We had 1 year break in 2020. So we are completing the 5th cycle this year with philosophy. In all these years, thanks to our truly outstanding speakers and fantastic audience, the Einstein Lectures have become one of the, if not the, academic highlight here in Bern. So it is a particular pleasure for me to welcome this year's Einstein lecturer. And I will hand over the microphone to my colleague, Professor Stepanians, to introduce Professor Susan Wolf to you. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear ambassadors and distinguished diplomats, dear students and members of the University of Bern, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Markus Stepanians, Professor of Practical Philosophy here in Bern. As Christiane Tretter just explained, the Einstein Lectures, we have them since 2009, and they always go around. It is we invite mathematicians, philosophers, and of course physicists. And this year it's the philosophers' turn. And we are extremely happy and grateful that one of the most original thinkers of our time, Professor Susan Wolf, has kindly accepted our invitation. Professor Wolf is the Edna J. Curry Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Emerita. She received her bachelor's degree summa cum laude in mathematics and philosophy from Yale University, followed by a master's degree and a PhD in philosophy from Princeton University. Professor Wolf's work is chiefly focused on ethics and its close relation to the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of action, political philosophy, and aesthetics. Her interests range widely over moral psychology, value theory, and normative ethics. Professor Wolf's lectures on the meaning of life and why it matters, given at Princeton in 2007 and published in 2010 by Princeton University Press, are already celebrated by many as a classic contribution to contemporary ethics. Of the many awards and prizes bestowed on Professor Wolf, I will here mention only the Andrew W. Mellon Distinguished Achievement Award and the honor of giving the John Locke Lectures at the University of Oxford. Last and certainly not least, Susan Wolf was awarded in 2021-22, right here in lovely Bern, the internationally renowned Launer Prize for an outstanding oeuvre in analytical philosophy. Over the next 3 evenings, Susan will talk to us about what it means to be truly human. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to this year's Einstein lecturer, Professor Susan Wolf.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. Well, it's an incredible honor to have been invited to give these lectures, both because of the enormous prestige and brilliance of the past Einstein lecturers, and the even more enormous prestige and brilliance of the man in whose honor these lectures were established. I want to thank the Einstein Society, the University of Bern, and the Einstein Lecture Committee for inviting me to give them, and all of you for coming to hear at least this one. I might mention that this photo was taken in 2018 on my first trip to Bern, long before I was invited or would have dreamed of being invited to give the Einstein Lectures. I just wanted to have a chat with the great man, though as it turned out, I carried the entire conversation. He didn't say a word. For these lectures, too, I would have liked, if not to engage with Einstein directly, at least to engage with his thought in some meaningful way. But I can hardly do that either, for although in my third lecture I will be talking about freedom and determinism, a subject on which Einstein also had views, I don't know enough about the details of his thought to project how he would have responded to my own thoughts about the subject. And I'm utterly incompetent to discuss his contributions to science. But in addition to what I know about Einstein as a scientist and as an intellect, I'm struck and impressed by what I've learned about Einstein the man. In particular, I'm impressed and gratified by the fact that while Einstein was uncontestably one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, he was not at all scientistic, as some scientists and even some philosophers are. That is, he did not believe that science was the sole foundation of our knowledge and understanding of the universe and our place within it. To the contrary, in addition to his love and appreciation for music, philosophy, human fellowship, and ethics, he believed that philosophy and science must work together for human understanding. He was, in other words, not a scientific scientist, but a humanist scientist. And for this reason, I'd like to think that these lectures, though not addressed to Einstein's specific ideas, are offered in an Einsteinian spirit. I hope this will become clearer in the course of what I have to say today and in the 2 lectures to come. Since the beginning of philosophy, indeed, since before there was a discipline of philosophy, people have been asking, what is it to be distinctively human? What is it, in other words, about us humans that makes us special and different from all other creatures? In recent years, however, the question has gone out of favor, and the sentiments that are assumed to motivate it tend to be viewed with suspicion. One might even say that the question has been turned on its head. Rather than ask how we are different from other creatures, philosophers, as well as natural and social scientists, are more prone to ask how we are like other creatures, bringing out continuities between members of our species and others, and showing how much we share with them, both physically and psychologically. Moreover, the trend towards blurring, de-emphasizing, and devaluing the lines that separate humans from others seem to be proceeding along 2 tracks. Some researchers bringing out the similarities between human and non-human animals, and others focused on the commonalities between humans and present and future machines. Much of the work being done in the service of this overall pursuit is fascinating, and much of the sentiment behind the alteration in attitude toward the idea of the distinctively human is salutary. So I feel somewhat uncomfortable in bucking the trend and trying to push the pendulum back in the other direction. Nonetheless, it is a version of that out-of-favor question that I want to bring back to focus today. And though I shall not be able to answer it satisfactorily, I hope to show that it is interesting enough, difficult enough, and important enough to make the effort to answer it worthwhile. Let me begin by explaining what I take the question to mean, and by preemptively defending the enterprise by investigating it against 2 plausible objections. As I've already mentioned, the question has been around since philosophy began, as one would expect of a discipline that can fairly be characterized as aimed at understanding ourselves and our relation to the world. Indeed, the question may be understood to be equivalent to the question, what is it to be among the selves, that we untheoretically embrace when we say that philosophy aims at understanding ourselves? What is it, in other words, to be a self like us, to be one of the ourselves that philosophy aims to understand? As I interpret the question, it is misunderstood if it is reduced to a question of biology. When philosophers and other humanists ask about the distinctively human, they tend to be interested in an ethical as opposed to a biological notion. They are interested in a concept that has fundamental practical significance, that identifies individuals that we can relate to in certain especially rich and rewarding ways, beings with whom we can be in community. And we know this is not a purely biological notion because we can imagine individuals who are not members of our species who satisfy these conditions. Winnie the Pooh, Superman, the replicants of Blade Runner, the Na'vi of the planet Pandora from the film Avatar, are all to some extent selves like us, though not of our species. I hope these references are cross-cultural enough to make sense to an international and especially to a Swiss audience. But for anyone to whom all these characters are unfamiliar, I will add one more, Globy, I believe he's pronounced, who, according to Wikipedia, is Switzerland's equivalent to Mickey Mouse. To flesh out the category in which I'm interested, it will help to recount and, for some of you, to recall a discussion by the philosopher P.F. Strawson in an essay called Freedom and Resentment. As some of you know, the essay as a whole is addressed to the problem of freedom and determinism. More specifically, it's intended as a move towards reconciliation between incompatibilists, or as Strawson calls them, pessimists, on the one hand, who fear that if determinism is true, then the practices of blame and praise, punishment and reward that rest on the assumption that we are responsible agents can never be justified, and compatibilists, or optimists, on the other hand, who believe that determinism poses no threat to these things. Though, as I've said, my third lecture will discuss that very problem, my interest today is only with the first stage of Strawson's argument, which involves shifting the scene of the debate. Traditionally, discussion of freedom and responsibility had focused on punishment and reward and on moral condemnation and approval. For these are the practices and attitudes that have seemed most obviously undermined by determinism. But as Strawson noted, these practices or attitudes admit, where they do not imply, a certain detachment from the actions or agents which are their objects. Strawson invites us to consider instead the non-detached attitudes and reactions of people directly involved in transactions with each other, the attitudes and reactions of offended parties and beneficiaries, including such things as gratitude, resentment, forgiveness, love, and hurt feelings. More generally, he asks us to think of the many different kinds of relationship which we can have with other people, as sharers of a common interest, as members of the same family, as colleagues, as friends, as lovers, as chance parties to an enormous range of transactions and encounters. Then, Strawson continues, we should think of the kind of importance we attach to the attitudes and intentions towards us of those who stand in these relationships to us, and of the kinds of reactive attitudes and feelings to which we ourselves are prone. The object of these commonplaces, he explains, is to try to keep before our minds something it is easy to forget when we are engaged in philosophy, namely, what it is actually like to be involved in ordinary interpersonal relationships, ranging from the most intimate to the most casual. Having turned our attention to this realm of interpersonal relationships and the range of attitudes we are prone to experience in the course of having them, Strawson draws a contrast between the attitude or range of attitudes of involvement or participation in a human relationship on the one hand, and what might be called the objective attitude or range of attitudes to another human being on the other. To adopt the objective attitude to another human being, Strawson writes, is to see him perhaps as an object of social policy, as a subject for what, in a wide range of sense, might be called treatment, as something certainly to be taken account, perhaps precautionary account of, to be managed or handled or cured or trained, perhaps simply to be avoided. The objective attitude, he says, may be emotionally toned in many ways, but not in all ways. It may include repulsion or fear, it may include pity, or even love, though not all kinds of love. It cannot include the range of reactive feelings and attitudes which belong to involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships. It cannot include resentment, gratitude, forgiveness, anger, or the sort of love which two adults can sometimes be said to feel reciprocally for each other. If your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, then though you may fight with him, you cannot quarrel with him, and though you may talk to him, even negotiate with him, you cannot reason with him. You can at most pretend to quarrel or to reason with him. Strawson's contrast between the attitude or range of attitudes of involvement or participation in a human relationship on the one hand, and the objective attitude or range of attitudes to another human being on the other, the contrast between what I shall refer to as the participant stance and the objective stance eloquently captures the difference between regarding someone as one of us, in the sense I'm concerned with, and regarding someone as alien or other. To take the participant stance towards another individual just is to relate to him or her interpersonally, as a potential friend or lover perhaps, but in any case as a member of the human community whose thoughts and actions we respond to reactively. But what is it that makes us, or perhaps better, what is it that should make us regard some individuals but not others with the participant stance? What features of an individual make that individual an appropriate object of that stance? That question is equivalent to the question, what is it to be distinctively human, as I mean to understand that phrase? In an attempt to pursue the question without courting confusion, some philosophers have used the term person to refer to what I am calling a self like us, explicitly distinguishing the concept of a person from the biological notion of a human being. Thus, John Locke, after introducing a thought experiment in which the psychology of a prince comes to inhabit the body of a cobbler, acknowledges that it would be a travesty of language to say of the transformed cobbler that he was the same man as the former prince. Still, he suggests, we can capture the important relation between the one and the other by referring to them as stages of the same person. A person, according to Locke, is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself the same thinking thing in different times and places. Peter Singer makes a similar distinction, using person to refer to a rational and self-conscious being. By keeping in mind the fact that persons, in this sense, need not themselves be members of our species, and that members of our species need not be persons, Singer believes that we can think more clearly about whether and why some individuals should be treated differently from others. But if some philosophers avoid the term human to refer to this non-biological notion, others continue to use it. Kant's principle of humanity is clearly meant to apply not to Homo sapiens, but to those Singer would call persons. And in Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt uses the terms human and person interchangeably in accordance with stylistic grace. In Freedom and Resentment, Strawson, too, seems to make no distinction between persons and humans, using both terms to refer to those beings towards whom we can take the participant stance. To my ears, the term person, when used philosophically in a way that is self-consciously not equivalent to human being, refers especially to rational, self-conscious agents in keeping with Locke and Singer. In addition to the imaginary talking animals, artificial intelligences, and extraterrestrials, it can, especially in legal contexts, refer to corporations and states. When people invoke the idea of the distinctively human, on the other hand, they tend to have something different from rational agency in mind. And it would be most unusual for someone to think of Nestle Company or the European Union as a self like us. Not wanting to beg any questions about the relation between selves like us and rational agency, I shall continue to use humanity in this non-biological way. I shall leave open for the moment how it relates to the term person as it's been used in philosophy. The concept of the distinctively human, then, is a non-biological notion equivalent to the notion of a self like us which, as I said, is an ethical category meant to be of fundamental practical significance. But what practical significance? In the spirit of Strawson's discussion of the participant's stance, I said that the concept identifies individuals that we can relate to in certain especially rich and rewarding ways, beings with whom we can be in community. But the notion of community is I'm a little confused about where I am, sorry. The notion of community is as imprecise and ambiguous as the term we are trying to pin down. Without a clearer statement of the purposes for which the concept of the distinctively human is to be used, or of the particular practical and ethical questions it is to have a role in answering, the concept may seem so vague and elusive as to be questionably a concept at all. At best, one might think that the notion is too slippery to be a proper object of philosophical analysis. The problem may be even more obvious if we consider the term selves like us, which I want to use interchangeably with the distinctively human. For who is the we, the us, this question hopes to characterize in an illuminating way? If we can answer this question from the start, it is doubtful that there's need of a philosophical investigation at all. But if we can't answer the question, what exactly are we asking? The concern that the category of the distinctively human is too poorly delineated to be a proper object of investigation, we may call the unclarity objection. Along with it, and perhaps even more pressing, there are moral concerns about this project. In other words, there is a moral objection as well. For one might reasonably worry that the exploration of the category of the distinctively human will serve as a pretext for treating one set of creatures as more important, worthy of respect and benefit than another. Identifying this category with the category of selves like us makes explicit the fact that we are talking about a distinction between an us and a them. The worry is that such a distinction will inevitably support attitudes and practices that are unjustifiably discriminatory, if not positively oppressive. Both these concerns are legitimate, and my responses are unlikely to satisfy everyone. But the conceptual problem of trying to understand and illuminate a concept that we cannot clearly delineate at the beginning of the inquiry is a common one in philosophy, and we can address it by means of the same methods we employ in our investigations of other questions. We begin with a term or a phrase that is used in common discourse, usually without any conscious awareness that one is not exactly sure what one means by it. We try to articulate the meaning of the term. Perhaps we propose an analysis of it. And then we move back and forth among intuitions, linguistic data, and theoretical thought, aiming to reach a reflective equilibrium between the proposal's ability to capture most of the term's pre-theoretical applications and its ability to illuminate or justify its use in paradigmatic cases. Further, and despite the fact that the inquiry is expressed as the search for an illumination of an apparently single and unified concept, we need not assume that the result of the inquiry will support this initial presumption. But how can we address the moral concern that any inquiry that takes seriously the idea of the distinctively human and that consequently looks to identify features that separate the indeterminate us from the anonymous them is liable to support morally objectionable practices and attitudes? Unquestionably, there's a historical basis for this concern. Appeals to the human have played a role in permitting ill treatment of other species, whether the term is used biologically or ethically, while in addition, in the non-biological case, it has been called into service in the justification of treating some people as inferior to others. Blacks and women, as well as the mentally impaired, have often been considered rationally defective and consequently less than fully human, despite their membership in the same species. Insofar as one takes the distinctively human to be a term with positive connotations, then, making use of the term carries with it the danger that creatures who lack the properties that entitle them to that label will be unduly neglected, mistreated, or oppressed. But it seems to me that there's equal danger in avoiding the term and any consequent inquiry into what it means. For the term and a variety of equivalent expressions are invoked in public as well as academic discourse more often than one might initially suppose. And the concept informs the way we think of ourselves in unconscious, subliminal ways. Since, as you'll see, my own interest in the topic aims in part at combating what seems to me an overly narrow and limited understanding of the term, we may hope that to that extent, the inquiry into the concept will result in a more rather than a less inclusive attitude this time around. Furthermore, we need not, and I believe we should not, identify the fact that a feature contributes to what makes us distinctively human with the thought that the feature is one that it is objectively valuable to have. We need not think that people or humans are superior to other creatures or things, more worthy of existence or concern from the point of view of the universe. Indeed, we need not think that selves like us are more worthy of existence and concern than other creatures, even from our own point of view. This is not incompatible, however, with using the term in a way that attaches positive connotations to the distinctively human. For the features that make us distinctively human contribute to our ability to relate to each other in distinctively rich and rewarding ways. Presumably, this is a good thing for us, even if it is a matter of indifference to the universe, and we may prize these features of ourselves as well as prizing the relationships they make possible without thinking that others who lack them are inferior. After all, we may prize our cultures without thinking that other cultures, or the people whose cultures they are worse. Philosophers may prize their love of philosophy without thinking that those who have no interest in philosophy are mistaken or stupid. Further, against the tendencies of narrower identities, such as cultural or ethnic identities, to serve as pretexts for indifference and disdain for those outside of one's group, an interest in the distinctively human can have a softening influence, giving us a basis for making connection to others across the divisions these other classifications set up. At the same time, the tendency to regard what we value in ourselves as things that make us uniquely valuable or special is a real one. One can only hope that to be forewarned is to be forearmed. So let us proceed. What does contribute to what makes us distinctively human? What is involved in being a self like us? The dominant tradition in Western thought has emphasized our intelligence, and more particularly, our capacity to reason. Given that the most obvious contrast class to the human is other animals, this isn't surprising, for we are smarter, I would say much smarter than at least most other animals. We are not only conscious, we are self-conscious, we are aware of ourselves as individuals in a world with other individuals, and we are rational and thus able to solve problems, to compare and weigh alternative actions, and determine which option will best meet our goals. These features already serve to distinguish us dramatically from most animals whose reactions to stimuli, at least so I imagine, are to a large extent hardwired and inflexible. They see a fast-moving dark object and flick their tongues to grab it. They hear a certain noise and go rigid, playing dead. A certain display leads to mating behavior, another to aggression. Animals whose behavior is fully governed in this way may have no thoughts beyond their perceptions. They make no choices, they just react. But even animals that can solve problems, use tools, and so on, are much less intellectually proficient than we are. As many have emphasized, our ability to use language is both reflective of and instrumental to a wealth of further intellectual abilities that divide us from other species. Being able to think abstractly and conceptualize possibilities allows us to engage in theoretical reasoning, to stand back imaginatively from how things are and conceive of how they might be. If contrasting ourselves with other animals makes our higher intelligence salient, however, consideration of other perhaps imaginary beings, who share or even surpass our cognitive and conceptual faculties, makes us mindful of other features that may just as strongly distinguish selves like us from others. The kinds of beings I have in mind include gods, extraterrestrials, and artificially intelligent machines. Fantasy and science fiction movies and books are full of such creatures. Evidently, we are fascinated by them. And some of the things that differentiate us from such features we may regard as weaknesses in ourselves. We are sentient, opening us to the experience of pain as well as pleasure. We have appetites which can lead us astray, causing us to act against our own interests as well as against the interests of others. We are fragile, fallible, vulnerable, and mortal. We are also both social and emotional creatures. Especially significant are our capacities for love and compassion. It is the absence of such dispositions that makes some portrayals of intelligent non-humans literally alien and terrifying. And when we see capacities for love or sympathy, or for dispositions resembling love and sympathy, in less intelligent species, it makes us regard them as closer to being selves like us, closer perhaps than the cold but super-rational creatures of our imagination. In one especially moving account from the 19th century, a member of a shooting party recounts a scene that followed his group's killing a female monkey, an event which provoked a great fuss from the monkey troop. At length, the author writes, the leader of the monkeys came to the door of the tent and, finding threats of no avail, began a lamentable moaning, and by the most expressive gesture seemed to beg for the dead body. It was given to him. He took it sorrowfully in his arms and bore it away to his expecting companions. They who were witnesses to the extraordinary scene, he continues, resolved never again to fire at one of the monkey race. Such scenes as this, we are told, repeatedly persuaded the people involved of the humanity of the monkeys, leading them to remove monkeys from the category of quarry. Such cases are perhaps enough to conclude that selves like us must be both intelligent and emotional. Both aspects may be necessary to account for a further distinctive feature of selves like us that philosophers like Harry Frankfurt, Gary Watson, and Christine Korsgaard have emphasized in recent years. Frankfurt famously noted that it is a distinctive feature of persons that they can stand back from their first-order desires and motives and ask whether they are desires and motives that they want to have and act on. In other words, we have the ability to ask what sorts of people we want to be and what sorts of lives we want to live. We can identify with some aspects of ourselves and disclaim others. We can form ideals and aspire to them. Linked to this is the availability of a distinction between values and desires, between things we simply want and things we care about, where caring is not simply a matter of wanting a great deal. It's hard to imagine that such distinctions and attitudes are available to any non-human animals, even relatively smart animals, such as elephants and monkeys. And I attribute this to the limitations of their cognitive and conceptual capacities. But I cannot imagine gods or intelligent machines being prone to such distinctions and attitudes either. For without passions or emotions, what could lead to a discrepancy between desire and care? Considering more specific attributes and activities that we especially cherish in ourselves and that non-humans don't seem to be capable of possessing, allows us to approach the question of what it is to be a self like us in a different way. Our abilities to make and appreciate art and to respond to beauty in art and nature play an enormous role in many of our lives. We might also consider our capacity for humor, or indeed for philosophy. One doesn't imagine or expect lower animals to have senses of humor or to be prone to philosophical speculation because we think or assume that animals lack the cognitive capacities for such things. But the fact that we do not typically imagine futuristic robots to exhibit these traits, nor know how one could program them or to have or develop these features, may be even more revealing. Terrible to cough into a microphone. What is it about these sensitivities and dispositions that make the idea of finding them in or building them into artificial intelligences so unlikely and surprising? Part of the answer may have to do with the fact that we often picture artificially intelligent individuals as being without sentience or emotion, for it is not clear whether beauty or humor could make sense to a purely cerebral being. Another part, I suspect, has to do with the fact that when we build computers or artificially intelligent machines, we do so with specific functions in mind. We program them to solve problems and to perform specific tasks. The reasoning we put into them is instrumental. And though I know that advanced machines are increasingly flexible, they teach themselves, change their own programs, and are therefore in some sense creative, it's my impression that these added abilities are still defined and shaped by their tendencies to aid in the achievement of more general predefined goals. Looking for and finding beauty and humor in the world, and asking and answering philosophical questions, however, are in a sense gratuitous. They can only serve a purpose for selves like us who find such things gratifying for their own sakes. Sensitivities to beauty, to humor, to philosophy, and the ability to create things that will reward such sensitivities thus seem to highlight propensities of selves like us beyond the features that I named earlier. A being that can cultivate an interest in philosophy must be able to approach the world with a kind of non-instrumental curiosity, if not a sense of wonder. To see beauty or humor in the world, one must have an eye or an ear for the interesting, the quirky, and so on. More basically, one must be the sort of being for which something's being more or less interesting, quirky, and so on makes sense. Sorry. Hope this goes away. Thus, I'm inclined to suggest that in order to be a self like us, one must have the capacity to be interested in things for their own sakes, and perhaps connected to this, a capacity to be curious and to ask and pursue answers to open-ended questions. For example, questions about the meaning of life, or about how to live, or about the interpretation of Hamlet. The fact that I cannot imagine how to program a computer to have these capacities does not mean that it can't or won't someday be done. My point is rather that if it were done, it would bring machines significantly closer to candidacy for inclusion in the group of selves like us. But perhaps in the interest of looking at the ways in which smart machines still lack features essential to being selves like us, I was too quick to dismiss the bonds we do and can have with non-human animals. Elephants paint, after all. Birds sing. Bunnies play. And cats are said to be curious. Is it possible that they do or can have the sorts of traits that we cherish in each other? It's instructive to think for a moment about what a sensitivity to beauty or humor for an animal, or for that matter for a young child, can be. I must confess that I don't really know. I'm not an ethologist, and even if I were, it would not be obvious or uncontroversial what it would take for an animal's behavior to constitute evidence of an aesthetic sensibility or of wit. But I do want to insist that an attraction to some visual shapes and forms as opposed to others, to red, curvy things, for example, or to pictures of kittens, does not an aesthetic sensibility make. Nor does a bird that responds predictably to a particular three-note pattern have a degree, however lowly, of musical appreciation. To be sure, one has to start somewhere in the development of an aesthetic sensibility, both in the evolution of our species and in the cultivation of our individual capacities. And it may well be that such attractions and their opposites form the foundation of our acquisition of aesthetic taste. An attraction to sweet things may be the beginning of the development of a culinary sensibility. The 6-year-old boy who is sent into peals of laughter by every use of the word toilet or breast may be at an incipient stage of a developing sense of humor. But as interesting as it is to notice a continuum between such simple attractions, repulsions, and sensitivities and the possession of a mature wit or aesthetic taste, it's also important to recognize how great the difference is between the primitive capacities at issue and their mature realization in normal human adults. For it is the developed forms and the potential for development that we cherish in ourselves and each other. It's the developed forms that contribute to an individual's distinctive identity that can provide a basis for admiration, respect, and relationship. To be capable of a developed form of humor, a philosophical turn of mind, an aesthetic taste, among other things, it appears that one needs a combination of intellectual faculties and some other dispositions, difficult to identify or pin down on their own, that motivate and open one up to certain sorts of discriminations and values. Lower animals appear to lack the intellectual faculties to the requisite degree, but the powers of reason that might make, say, an artificially intelligent individual capable of solving all sorts of predefined problems may also be insufficient to ensure that it is capable of developing in these recognizably human ways. Moreover, the kinds of intellectual capacities needed to combine with primitive capacities for interest, amusement, and pleasure for the development of humor, taste, and so on, are not well captured if we identify intelligence or intellectual capacity with reason or rationality. I'm not sure what faculties are involved in the acquisition of a developed sense of humor or aesthetic taste, but I wouldn't be surprised if these faculties were not picked up by our standard intelligence tests or college entrance exams. So far, I've looked at attributes and activities that might be thought to be particularly demanding of our intellects, and this may give rise to a concern that my picture of the distinctively human looks suspiciously like that of an academic philosopher. By selves like us, a critic might suggest, I seem to have in mind selves like me. That is, like Susan Wolf, nerdy, bourgeois, 70-something American female. I acknowledge a danger of that, as it seems to me there's always a danger in philosophizing about the human condition that one will overgeneralize about one's own case or those in one's close surrounding social world, projecting their faculties, interests, and values onto the species or community as a whole. The only way to protect against that or correct this that I know of is to ask for help from others, for example, from you. If my claims about what we cherish strike you as idiosyncratic or narrow, please point it out. Not right this minute, but later. If my views are elitist or provincial, say something or write something that shows in what ways they are. But first, let me make a few remarks preemptively in my defense. First, we should be careful not to over-intellectualize what counts as a developed and mature form of humor or of aesthetic taste or of philosophy. Though some humor is highly cerebral, much is not. The physical comedy of Buster Keaton or Steve Martin is as different from a rodent's disposition to laugh when tickled as that of Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw. And the impulse to create and to appreciate aesthetic experience should not be understood in a way that confines this to engagement with the higher or finer arts. The aesthetic impulse shows itself in craft, in fashion, even in the tattoo parlor, as it does in kitchens all over the world. And the music that is passed down from generation to generation in the hollers of Appalachia is as far from birdsong as the compositions performed by the Berlin Philharmonic. Nor are the quests for meaning and self-understanding that are the basis of the urge to philosophize restricted to the educated upper classes. Arguably, the religion and mythologies of ancient and indigenous cultures are symptoms of it, and if not, they are surely symptoms of something distinctively human I have not yet named. But second, it's also instructive to consider activities that we are not even tempted to think of as particularly intellectual, For example, athletics. For although we do admire animals for their physical elegance and skills, the grace and swiftness of a gazelle or a cheetah, for example, the acrobatics of a squirrel leaping from windowsill to bird feeder, or the mouth-eye coordination of a frisbee-catching golden retriever, the kind of admiration we have for human athletes seems to me to be of a qualitatively different kind. In the case of team sports or competitive games, this is at least partly due to the complexity of the performances in question. To play basketball or tennis, one must take in kinds of information, make kinds of decision, exercise kinds of judgment that other animals are incapable of. Moreover, such skills have to be learned, not only because they involve conventional rules, but also because it requires training and ingenuity to be able to train and develop oneself beyond a certain point. Connected to this, perhaps, is another feature of distinctively human endeavors that we have not yet emphasized, namely the capacity to struggle against one's natural tendencies, to push oneself beyond one's natural limits. Though animals can be persistent, they cannot choose to be. They cannot display determination. They cannot possess strength or, for that matter, weakness of will. When we compare an Olympic swimmer to a fish, a world-class mountain climber to a yak, both the expertise and the determination required for their activities are different, making the activities achievements for the human athletes in a way they cannot be for the animals. When human beings paint or sing, climb mountains, or take walks, when they are doing something significantly different from an elephant or a warbler, a mountain goat, or a bear, whose behavior we may use the same phrases to describe. In each case, the human's greater cognitive powers, their intelligence, invest the activity with a meaning it cannot have in the case of their animal counterparts, making it plausible for others to see in the human activities reflections or expressions of selves like us. But these cognitive powers are not easily grasped or described in ways that we can imagine programming into machines. Journals and books and YouTube videos are full of stories that bring out and celebrate the often surprising abilities of non-human animals and machines. They tell us how smart some of these animals are and how much new computers can do. But in some contexts, it's important also that we consider what they cannot do, or at any rate, how different they are from us. Importantly, the differences in what these other sorts of individuals do and can do seem to be reflections of differences in what they are or can be. In particular, I'm inclined to say they are not and cannot be selves in a robust sense of that term. Their psychologies, in the case of those who have psychologies, are not rich enough to give them individual, variegated points of view of the kind we respond to as one subject to another, as potential members of a human community, as appropriate objects of the participant's stance. Thinking about the difference between what goes on when a human being paints a picture or composes a song and what goes on when an elephant or a machine does these things, it seems reasonable to think that in the former case, but not the latter, the individual is expressing something. There is, as we might say, a self behind the painting or the song that is reflected in what the creator creates. And this rightly affects the way we see or hear the art, as well as the way we relate to the artist. This is true even if one is primarily or even exclusively interested at the conscious level in the art alone and not its creator. It seems to me that the same can be said of our attitudes towards and interest in sports. Sports fans might well think of themselves as not having any interest in the psychologies of the players. They do not typically care about the athletes' lives, their thoughts, their politics. They just want to see a good game. But the interest we would have in watching a game played by two teams of basketball-playing robots or a competition between two robotic golfers would be very different from the interest we have in the human games. And this brings out that what we typically care about in sports is also deeply connected to the fact that the athletes who are engaging in them are selves like us, realizing their potential in ways that reflect their individual efforts and styles. What is it then to be a self like ours? I don't have a satisfying answer. My repeated suggestions to imaginatively contrast human activities with both animal and robotic ones are offered both as substitutes and as goads towards finding a more illuminating characterization. In the meantime, I suggest that being a self involves having a take on the world that involves evaluative assessments as well as physical discriminations, that see objects, activities, goals, and so on as more or less worthwhile, interesting, or good. Moreover, it is part of the idea of a self that such evaluative discriminations are not blind or arbitrary, but are rather results of an active intelligence that synthesizes thoughts, experiences, perceptions, and desires, continually updating the self's point of view so that it is, in principle, always subject to change. As a way of fleshing this out, I'm inclined to say that selves, and only selves, can have characters, as opposed to mere collections of behavioral and psychological dispositions, that only selves can understand and appreciate things, as opposed to merely being in possession of facts, and that consequently only selves can have virtues and vices. Though I do not know how to prove such things, I hope they will be plausible when one thinks not only about how a chess-playing computer or a robotic basketball player differs from a human one, and how an elephant painter or a singing bird differs from a human artist, but also when one compares what it means when people say that lions are courageous, that lambs are gentle, and that crocodiles are mean, with what we mean when we attribute these qualities to individual people. As I've said before, it doesn't really matter for my purposes whether the generalizations I've been making about animals and robots are literally true. It doesn't matter, that is, whether it's literally true that no animal or machine can be courageous in the way a human can be courageous, that no animal or machine can make a painting that could mean what a human can mean when she paints. For my point is not to insist that selves like us are restricted to members of our own species. My point is rather to call attention to what it is to have the qualities that we value in ourselves, that allow us to relate to each other with the participant stance, so that we do not settle for overly crude descriptions of these qualities and thereby misunderstand or neglect things that we at least subconsciously value. The reason for comparing a lion's courage to human courage is to understand what we mean by courage. The reason for comparing a chorus of birds to an a cappella group is to understand what we mean by music. And more generally, the reason to compare human to non-human animals, machines, and other conceivable rational beings is to understand what it is to be a self like us. That is, to be enough of a self and enough like us to be a candidate for membership in a certain particularly rewarding kind of community, for participation with others, in Strawson words, in interpersonal human relationships. Aside from the intrinsic interest of such a project, which I hope is considerable, engaging in it may help us avoid certain errors. Against the background in particular of a history in which the association of humanity with rationality has been overemphasized, attention to the ways in which rationality falls short and to the ways in which other features contribute to being a self like us may serve as a useful corrective. One place where the inquiry may have practical relevance is in the area of education, where the growing tendency, first to see education in purely instrumental terms, and second, to strongly favor training in the STEM disciplines, that is, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, over support for the arts and humanities may be linked to the unreflective association between our humanity, or our personhood, and our reason. And on this, I am happy to say, I believe Einstein would agree. Attention to this issue should also make a difference, I think, to many issues in philosophy and the social sciences. For the overemphasis on reason and rationality and the corresponding under-emphasis on other features of human psychology have shaped not only our conception of what is distinctively human, but our analyses of many of the other features with which our humanity is associated. For example, I believe it has affected our analyses and understandings of such concepts as intelligence, value, character, and responsibility, some of which I will be exploring in the next 2 lectures. If we identify being a self like us with being an appropriate object of a participant's stance, and identify both with the idea of being distinctively human, then we should recognize that there is a gap between that concept and the familiar philosophical concept of what it is to be a person, which identifies it, as Locke and Singer do, with the possession of rationality, self-consciousness, and self-control. Given the dominance that the properties of rationality, self-consciousness, and self-control have long held in philosophical treatments of what it is to be human, one might not unreasonably see this talk as carrying the message that these properties have been overrated. Nonetheless, the powers of rational deliberation and control are distinctively important, and there are some contexts where they are overwhelmingly more important than any of the other features characteristic of selves like us. It is those powers in particular that give us the ability to negotiate with each other, that allow us to formulate norms and follow them, that make it possible for us to establish complex systems of enforcement, expectation, and trust. In short, that allow us to cooperate with each other in ways on which civilization, and according to some theories, morality, depends. Whoops, not yet, almost. The point of this talk, then, is not to cast that category into doubt or to derogate the significance of rational deliberation as a feature of our identity. It's rather to warn against identifying being a person in this sense with being a self like us, a member of the broader and messier category to which one refers when one talks about what falls within the range of the distinctively human. If we do not notice or keep in mind that being human is more than or other than being a rational agent capable of deliberation and choice, we may unwittingly let our humanity atrophy, and we will certainly fail to attain the understanding of ourselves to which philosophy aspires.